Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. The Republic. By Plato. In 380 BC, Plato wrote The Republic, a Socratic discussion. There's been a lot of discussion over how long ago the dialogue took place. According to legend, this may have occurred during or just after the Peloponnesian War, 460 BC. Plato's most well-known work, The Republic, has been hailed as one of the most significant philosophical and political treatises ever written. Athens philosophers Socrates and others debated the essence of justice and the ideal city in this book. Socrates discusses how a city can go through many cycles of government and how the honest man is happier than the unjust. His speech ends with an example of what could happen to an individual who succumbs totally to his own desires and worst instincts, which is the worst possible outcome for the man. After that, he talks about reincarnation and the immortality of the soul. Book 1. Plato's The Republic begins with Socrates and one of his brothers, Glaucon, going home. Along the way, they run upon Adeimantus, a Plato brother they've never met before. Polemarchus, a young nobleman, is his name. The gathering is invited to the home of the nobleman. He wants his father, Cephalus, to meet Socrates, the great professor. There is a lengthy exchange between Socrates and Cephalus about the advantages of experience. In the course of the conversation, the topic of justice is brought up. Cephalus, a well-known businessman and member of the Greek government, weighs in with his insights. Truthfulness and compliance with the law are essential to justice. There are no exceptions. Socrates is well known for his ability to argue any topic from any angle he chooses to take. As a result, he offers an illustration of a counter-argument. If a madman had his weapon taken away, what would happen? There was no choice but to return the weapon based on Cephalus' interpretation. Cephalus heads to the altar to supervise the sacrificial offerings. Polemarchus, his son, steps in to resolve the conflict. He's a young politician with a lot of ambition, and he believes that justice should be used both for one's allies and one's opponents. The counter-argument of Socrates is that we are not necessarily allies with those of great morals, and vice versa. Socrates has demonstrated the dangers of using justice as a weapon with this argument. Thrasymachus, the sophist and instructor of virtue, enters the fray next. Laws and morality should be abolished, according to his plan. According to him, justice is when the powerful rule over those who are weak. Doing what is right never benefits you, it always benefits others. He believes that justice is an unnatural action for people to engage in. As such, it ought to be repealed since it restricts our free will. This alters the debate. It is not enough to define justice, it must also be shown to be valuable. Socrates makes three arguments in his dialogues. First, Thrasymachus must admit that he is advocating injustice as a virtue, which is something he should be ashamed of. To him, life is a never-ending race to amass more wealth, authority, and so on. The most moral person is the one who has the most power. Because it goes against the grain of wisdom, which is itself a virtue, this can't be the case. Second, Socrates emphasizes the importance of adhering to a set of guidelines if the world is to become a more moral place. According to him, a just man is content, and an unjust one is miserable. Therefore, taking advantage of the weak and oppressed is always less profitable than seeking justice. By the end of Book 1, neither the group nor the importance of justice had come any closer to a solid definition. To defend justice against sophists, however, they all agree that an answer must be found. At this point, I can't tell whether or not the virtue of justice exists, Socrates continues, and I don't know how happy I can be with that virtue. Book 2. Socrates is startled to see the debate on justice continue at the opening of Book 2. In response to young Glaucon's question, does Socrates intend to convince them that being just is preferable to being unjust, or is that merely a ruse? So when Socrates responds that he wants to convince them, Glaucon immediately lists the three types of good that he can think of. For starters, there's the good we want for its own sake, rather than merely what it will do. This type of good isn't about the travel itself, rather, it's about the long-term effects it will have. Exercising, eating well, and so on are examples of healthy lifestyle choices. After that comes money-making pursuits as the next good category. Glaucon goes on to question Socrates on which category justice belongs under. Glaucon points out that the majority of people believe that justice fits under the second group. While it's true that the pursuit of justice is a hard thing to do, it should only be pursued for the sake of a paycheck and the good name it brings with it. Glaucon uses an example to bolster his case. Gyges' ring is the subject of a legend. In the middle of herding his sheep, a plain shepherd is interrupted by an earthquake. There are 2 windows in the hollow bronze horse. Peeking out the window, he discovers a man's corpse that dwarfs him in stature. One of the only things it wears is a gold ring that has fallen off of its finger. As time goes on, he'll wait with the other shepherds for his monthly report to the king, which he will provide while wearing the ring. Turning the ring inadvertently causes him to disappear from view. He emerges from the shadows when he twists it again. The queen was the first person he had sex with. Afterwards, he killed the king and took over the country. If there were 2 rings and one was owned by an unjust man while the other belonged to a righteous one, both men would behave in the same way, claims Glaucon. The just and the unjust alike would find it difficult to refrain from action without fear of consequences. For the unjust man, Glaucon claims, wealth is bestowed upon him, while the righteous are despised. Adeimantus then agrees with Glaucon, saying that the righteous seek their reward in the afterlife. After that, he asks Socrates to make it sound like a good idea to just be yourself. Even if it doesn't bring happiness or knowledge, justice can be a virtue in and of itself. Book 3. Socrates needs to set some ground rules for this part of the course because it involves storytelling. Even when they are afraid, heroes must show bravery in the face of adversity. The heroes must be terrified of Hades in order to avoid taking risks that could lead them to its gates. They need to grieve for their lost comrades. They should also avoid feeling angry or enraged. But most importantly, he must be open and forthcoming with his thoughts and ideas. Socrates, when Glaucon asks him about the stories of ordinary mortal men, puts them on the back burner for the time being. Those tales laud wrongdoers and penalize righteous ones. Those stories must first be disproved before they can go back and prove that justice is good. Their stories should be lyrical or dramatic, Socrates explains to the students. Next, he discusses many forms of art including painting. Rather from being brash or ruthless, their national heroes or guardians should exude dignity and grace. Swordplay and fight training, not the kind you do as an athlete, should be the focus of these guardians' workouts. It's critical to strike a balance between physical exercise and instruction in the arts of music and poetry as well. They would become savages if they did too much physical training, while they would become soft if they did too much music and poetry. Later in the dialogue, Socrates discusses his vision for a medical education in the just city. Patients with a single, curable sickness should only be treated by doctors, not those with long-term health issues. They should be allowed to die in peace. A person should be put to death if they have an incurable mental illness. The 4th book. The city they are creating with their stories, says Socrates, must be a joyful place for all of its citizens. The happiness of one individual should not come at the expense of another's. To keep everything under check, they'll have to deal with each component in turn. So there won't be any prosperity or poverty in this city. Adeimantus informs out that a city that lacks revenue is unable to protect itself. According to Socrates, if neighboring cities were guaranteed the entirety of the battle's gains, they'd be pleased to lend a hand. Socrates aspired to keep the city from becoming unmanageably enormous. The guardians would be entitled to the same share of everything, even wives and children. Since their moral compass would be maintained by their carefully guarded education, no laws would be necessary. The city of justice is now ready. The values of intellect, courage, moderation, and justice will all be present in this city since it is the best one possible. The city's guardians, who wield great power, are a wellspring of knowledge. The men who are truly fighting for the city need to find courage. Laws that require everyone to do their part to improve the city are based on moderation and justice, and these principles are reflected in the selection of city leaders. The perfectly just city is designed. Now what about a person? Book 5. Polemarchus and Adeimantus interrupt Socrates in the middle of his discourse on the just city and the just soul. They want to know more about the guardian's decision to share spouses and children. Women, according to Socrates, will obtain the same education as males. They'd get a crash course in government and civics. He believes that in an ideal city, women would be seen as equals to males in terms of spirit, intelligence, and rationality. There would be no mating between males and females save at specific times of the year known as festivals. For the duration of the intercourse, they would be married. In a single festival, a person who is attractive or who wants to have children can get married up to 5 times. If any children were born, their fathers would be unknown, and they would be taken away from their parents and reared together. Children born as a result of such relationships would be put to death. To avoid incest, everyone must consider each child born within 7 and 10 months after copulation to be their child, and all children would regard the children born within that period as brothers and sisters. City unity would be guaranteed by this. When it comes to civic pride, most people prioritize their relationships with the people in their immediate families over everything else. Everyone knows each other's business in this town. All of the city's goals and concerns are aligned. This arrangement and whether or not asking individuals to give up riches, family ties, and romantic ties is viable are questions that Socrates' students must be answered before he can add more to his ideal guardianship. Youngsters should accompany their teachers into battle, just like any other apprentice would. However, they should be able to immediately retreat on horseback in the event of defeat. Also, the title of guardian should be revoked for anyone who behaves in a timid manner. When an army is defeated, he explains what should be done with the captured soldiers. It is wrong to force them into slavery and destroy their land if they are Greek. In the future, Greece will once again be one country. Barbarians, or anyone who isn't Greek, on the other hand, are in for a surprise. It was up to his guardians to enslave the barbarians and treat them as they saw fit. Book 6. Since only true philosophers are endowed with knowledge, they are the most qualified individuals to determine what is best for the city and how it might be properly governed in order to preserve its holiness. If we could be confident that the philosophers were virtuous, or at the very least, not below others in their virtue, it would be certain that they were the ones best suited for ruling. Fortunately, we know that a philosopher is more upright than the typical individual since they cherish and uphold truth. Philosopher, by definition, is a lover of wisdom or truth. As such, the logical side of a philosopher's psyche must be in charge. Because of this, his soul is unblemished. Despite Socrates' description, Adeimantus is skeptical because he has never met a philosopher like the one described. According to him, most philosophers are sluggish and ineffective, while the few that aren't tend to be cruel and vindictive in their approach to the subject. Socrates, to his surprise, agrees with Adeimantus in this regard. His main argument is that the current generation of philosophers has not been brought up in the proper manner, according to him. Those who are born today with a natural philosophical nature, that is, a guy with a quick wit, a lofty sensibility and high mind, a daring temperament, and a powerful memory, are sure to be swiftly harassed by relatives and friends wanting to create something for themselves out of his natural gift. When their relatives and friends pressure them to join the political arena in order to gain money and power, they are often coerced into it. As a result, they are unable to engage in any form of philosophical activity. In their place, people who lack their inherent talent are used as philosophers when they should not be. These are the people who are vile and vindictive when they grow up. As a result of society's decline in morality, the few decent philosophers who remain uncorrupted are considered useless. Socrates uses the analogy of a ship that is owned by a deaf, blind, and illiterate person. Even though no one on the ship is qualified to be captain, the crew begins to argue over who should be in charge. It is only via brutal force and deception that they can persuade the ship owner into becoming them captain. Successful individuals are referred to as captains, whereas those who fail are labeled useless, despite the fact that they all employed the same methods to achieve their goals. According to Socrates, the genuine captain in this situation would be the most pointless stargazer of them all because he is the only one who has any knowledge of navigational issues. Athens is currently in a similar situation, he says. Instead of using honest methods to advance in life, most people employ ingenious ruses and deceptive practices. There is a perception that the best philosophers are pointless. To produce a competent philosopher, Socrates concludes that all they need is one individual who has been taught in the proper manner and understands the forms. He doesn't think it's out of the question. Book 7. Socrates uses the allegory of the cave at the opening of Book 7, which is one of the most powerful and well-known analogies in Western philosophy. He paints a picture of a gloomy cave filled with shackled inmates. All their lives, they've been chained up in a way that limits their vision to only what's directly in front of them. The cave and the shadows generated by the fire on the wall are the only things the inmates have ever known. These inmates are designed to symbolize the lowest level of creativity. A prisoner is eventually released from his restraints and brought up close to a blazing fire. In order to see the statues, he is forced to look at them up close. Astoundingly, the prisoner feels awed by this. That which has been his only reality for so long is not just a pale reflection, but rather a complete illusion. The shadows are cast by the combination of the fire and the statues, and he notices this for the first time. He believes that the statues, the fire, and the cave are the only things that exist, and he has no idea that the outside world still exists. The believing step of the line is here. A prisoner is eventually released from his restraints and brought up close to a blazing fire. In order to see the statues, he is forced to look at them up close. Astoundingly, the prisoner feels odd by this. That which has been his only reality for so long is not just a pale reflection, but rather a complete illusion. He notices how the shadows are cast by the sculptures and the fire. Until he realizes that there is a wider world outside of the cave, he believes the statues, the fire, and the cave to be the only true things in the universe. The believing step of the line is here. It is then time for the prisoner to be taken outside and into the sunlight. When he first sees it, he can't bear to stare at it since he's so taken aback. Soon, he begins to recognize real-world items such as houses, people, and trees. To his surprise, he has realized that the sculptures are nothing more than replicas of the people and objects they depict. For the first time, he sees the most genuine things, the forms. The prisoner knows that the sun is the source of everything around him when he gazes at it. In this way, we might say that this is the shape of good. The detainee is now capable of comprehending. Using this analogy, Socrates concludes that education has an impact on a person's soul. Prisoner, or philosopher, progress through the stages of the split line and into good form only by means of education. The ultimate purpose of education should be to bring everyone out of their cave of ignorance. There should be an emphasis on educating people so that their thoughts might be directed toward the ideal form of the good. However, they must occasionally return to the shadows in order to help other inmates. Book 8. After discussing the just city, Socrates returns to the four unjust city and human constitutions, which he describes in detail. Socrates says there are four more city/man pairings in addition to the ones he's already revealed. The timocracy exists, and the man in charge of it must have a strong sense of honor. Oligarchs who are exclusively driven by their most essential desires will dominate the oligarchy. It's a democracy that's driven by someone who has too many extraneous desires. Finally, there is tyranny, which can only be established by a man who is motivated solely by his own personal gain. Tyranny, on the other hand, is the worst of all possible constitutions. Since their city is human, Socrates believes these are not theoretical or independent states but rather ones that the city would unavoidably cycle between. When the city's rulers choose the next generation, he argues, more and more mistakes will be made in this area until the worst kind of individuals take over the government, which will happen eventually. Greed will be the driving force behind these individuals, and they'll do anything to get their hands on money and land. After a conflict, the old rulers will finally accept a timocracy because they still want virtue as their rule. The population will be enslaved by the rulers, who will take over the city's territory. They will wage battles, but they will not engage in any agricultural or labor activities. Their obsession with winning will soon take over their lives totally. As time goes on, the timocracy will degenerate into an oligarchy. When one's wealth rises to an absolute minimum, one is automatically elevated to the position of king. And those who don't have a say in the city will be ignored. As soon as we have a democracy, people will turn to lending money at exorbitant interest rates in order to get their hands on the most money. As a result of this disparity, the majority of the city's residents are forced into poverty, while a small number of residents become richer than ever before. The rich will eventually be overthrown by the poor. They plan to create a new constitution so that everyone can have a say in deciding the country's direction. There is no consideration given to who is most suited for a certain position. As a result, there is no sense of harmony or order. This is the beginning of dictatorship. The citizens' thirst for unrestricted freedom leads them to disregard any rule or regulation. The past revolt's leader is now the poor people's tyrant. He kills anyone who he perceives as a threat to his rule and enslaves the rest of humanity in order to enrich himself further. He goes to battle all the time in order to keep the people's attention off of what else he is doing. Book 9. Socrates' depiction of a dictatorial man is depicted in Book 9. Lawless desires have taken hold of the despotic guy. A democratic man's son who takes a small step toward anarchy. Shamelessness and a lack of restraint control him. A great need for erotic pleasure has taken precedence over all of his other considerations in his life. Life's comforts are all the tyrant man cares about. He eats, drinks, and sleeps his way through every party and every lady he comes across. He swiftly exhausts his savings and is forced to take out loans. When he's run out of options for borrowing money, he turns to murder in order to get more. Having brought to life all of our darkest fantasies, he has transformed into a waking nightmare, a sleepwalker. In the near future, he will do whatever it takes to maintain his current lifestyle. He has no friends and has no faith in anyone. That which is good about him is hidden behind the most violent elements. Everyone believes this is the worst possible conclusion after he describes the terrifying tyrant man. Socrates, on the other hand, is not on board. There's one worse than that. In contrast to the private tyrant he depicted, he was talking about a politician. Socrates enlists the help of his companions in imagining a future in which the tyrant, his family, and his slaves are all stranded on a remote island. The tyrant would begin to dread retaliation if there was no law to protect him from the slaves he had mistreated. Being a tyrant is like this. Fearing revenge for his sins, he is always on the lookout for his death. Because of all the enemies he has made, he becomes a prisoner of his own fear. One of the saddest men in the world is this despot. The aristocracy, on the other hand, is the happiest man in the world. In the actual world, justice is a good thing. Book 10. Socrates returns to the subject of poetry and human beings after concluding his argument for why it is good to be a just man. Quite unexpectedly, he has exiled all poets from the town. Because of these three reasons, he considers them to be hazardous and unclean. In order to make us sympathize with those who lust and sorrow excessively as well as laugh at silly things, they use images from the worst portion of the soul. Socrates argues that the satisfaction we have in engaging in these feelings transfers over into our real lives, despite the fact that the poetry is about a fictional character. Socrates regrets expelling the poets despite all of these reasons. The city's mayor says he'll let them back and if someone can make a strong case for them. Then, he provides a few examples of evidence that the soul is eternal. Injustice and vices are the only things that can harm a person's soul. However, it is evident that these things do not kill the soul, as people would not be able to survive for long if they did. Because of this, the soul is unaffected by death. It's indestructible. Socrates concludes his defense of justice. Warrior killed in combat but not completely dead and sent to heaven to monitor what happens there so he may relate what he has seen down on earth, he explains. He sees the rewards for good deeds and knowledge being handed out. For 1,000 years, people are either sent to paradise or hell, and then reunited to make a decision about their next incarnation. A person has the option of choosing between becoming an animal or a human, and their decision will have an impact on their reward or punishment in the future life. While on Earth, only those who were philosophical were able to see this ingenious deception and choose to spend their lives in accordance with their beliefs. Everyone else in the situation has to go back and forth between misery and happiness on a daily basis. Socrates was alive between 469 and 399 BC. A Greek philosopher who served as Plato's mentor. Scholars are not quite certain what Socrates was like or what Plato's beliefs were when he used the moniker Socrates because most of what we know about him comes from Plato's writings. One of the alleged founders of Western philosophy is Socrates. He would pretend to not comprehend what the other person in the debate was saying in order to encourage him to talk so much that he lost track of the topic, while Socrates, who was actually extremely educated on the subject, made the other person look foolish. This technique is known as Socratic irony. He was also well known for the Socratic method, as it is presently known. This technique involves posing and responding to inquiries in order to encourage critical thinking. His philosophical research focused on epistemology, a subfield of philosophy that examines the limitations of human knowledge. The famous quote from Socrates is, "I know that I know nothing." The Oracle of Delphi caused Socrates' demise. Socrates objected, claiming that he knew nothing, despite the oracle's assertion that he was the city's wisest man. He began questioning each noble, only to find that the oracle had been accurate. He was a genius because he was the only one who didn't think he was. Unfortunately, many influential people were offended by the questions. Socrates was pronounced guilty after being charged for corrupting Athens' young and disbelief in the city's gods. Drinking poison and passing away was his sentence. The older brother of Plato and a young man of noble descent is Glaucon. He can respond to inquiries on musical theory because he is a musician. Glaucon keeps a variety of animals as pets, so Socrates also inquires about animal husbandry. Beginning with the festival, Glaucon and Socrates are making their way back to Athens in the Republic. He participates in the topic about justice when he, Plato, and Socrates visit the home of Polemarchus and meet Thrasymachus, and he later brings it up to Socrates to keep the conversation going. In his perspective, people respect laws in order to benefit from good behavior out of dread of the penalties associated with breaking them. If given the chance, everyone would act unfairly if it weren't for the penalties of poor behavior. Plato's older brother Adeimantus. He represents the pragmatic side of the argument. Education and the pleasure of the inhabitants of the city Socrates is imagining are his two main priorities. He is renowned for his inquiries into the wealth of the fictional city. Polemarchus is the son of well-known businessman Cephalus. Polemarchus is the one who started the entire conversation about justice and has a political career aspiration. Thrasymachus is a sophist and a morality teacher. He believes that justice is on its way out and that humankind will no longer require it to maintain urban centers. He is pretty pessimistic. Greek philosopher Plato is regarded as one of the most innovative and important philosophers in Western thought. In Athens, Greece, in 428 BC, Plato was born into an affluent family. His father, Ariston, was reputed to be a descendant of Athens' first kings. His mother, Perictione, was related to Solon, a legislator from the 6th century BC. When Plato was a young boy, his father passed away, and after that, his mother wed Pyrilampus, a friend of the statesman Pericles. When he was younger, Plato had political aspirations, but he soon gave them up after growing disenchanted with Athens' ruling class. He eventually accepted Socrates' ideas and teaching methodology and started to learn from him. In 399 BC, Plato was there when Socrates was executed by the Athens democracy. He temporarily left Athens and traveled to Italy, possibly out of fear for his personal safety. The Athens Academy was established by Plato in 387 BC, and it is frequently referred to as the first university in Europe. It offered a wide range of classes, covering topics like astronomy, biology, algebra, political theory, and philosophy. The Academy's most well-known pupil was Aristotle. In order to teach Dionysius the Younger, the new king of Syracuse, how to rule rationally, Plato traveled to Sicily in 367 BC. However, the experiment was a failure. In 361 BC, Plato went back to Syracuse, but this time his attempts to get involved in Sicilian affairs fell flat. He spent his final years writing and delivering lectures at the Academy. In either 348 or 347 BC, he passed away in Athens at the age of 80. The works of Plato were dialogues. Philosophical concepts were advanced, debated, and defended in the course of an interaction between two or more persons. 35 conversations and 13 letters are part of one of the earliest known collections of Plato's writings. It is difficult to gauge the extent of Plato's influence on philosophy throughout history. The philosopher Speusippus, who passed away around 339 BC, succeeded him as head of the Academy. The school remained open until AD 529, when Justinian I, the Byzantine emperor at the time, ordered its closure due to what he perceived to be its pagan teachings. The Florentine Academy, established in the 15th century, was the main center of Platonic influence during the Renaissance. The Academy's students read Plato in its original Greek language. In the 17th century, Ralph Cudworth and a small group of individuals known as the Cambridge Platonists revived Platonism in England. The 21st century has been impacted by Plato's ideas. The Florentine Academy, established in the 15th century, was the main center of Platonic influence during the Renaissance. The Academy's students read Plato in its original Greek language. In the 17th century, Ralph Cudworth and a small group of individuals known as the Cambridge Platonists revived Platonism in England. The 21st century has been impacted by Plato's ideas. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.